Okay, so I'm going to walk you through these plugins that are on this mastering chain and what exactly I did to master this and what it sounds like before and what it's after. But before I get into that, what I want to do is make sure that we're very clear about what mastering actually is. All right, so mastering, what it used to be back in the day when there was like CDs and vinyls and tape cassettes and all that stuff, where it was, the physical mediums were in bigger demand. Mastering engineers used to walk around labs with little white coats or wearing white coats and stuff like that. And their sole purpose was simply to take the music and transfer it from one medium to another medium. So their only job was to make sure that the music was prepared for its final destination or its delivery, right? And that was it. They would do it. They would deal with things like ISRC codes or UPCs and all this stuff to make sure the tracking was all in place for the music when it got distributed and all that stuff. So mastering engineers were actually not in the business of actually mastering and putting plugins on things like what we know mastering to be today. And so fast forward to today, and now what mastering really is it's still preparing things for their final medium. However, the final medium might be Spotify, it might be iTunes, it might be streaming platforms, it might be YouTube, right? And so the mastering engineer's job is still to prepare the music for its final medium. However, a lot of times they might be applying plugins and processing and things like that to get it ready to make sure that it's ready to go for that final medium. Now, if you're doing things like pressing things to vinyl, there is definitely a mastering engineer who is going to pay special attention to the frequencies of the track, because when you cut things to vinyl, you can't have too much low end and you can't have too much high end, and depending on where the song sits on the record, if it's closer to the middle of the spindle, like the center part of the record, or if it's closer to the edge, there's those things you have to take into account. So the mastering engineer really is just making sure that the track is ready for its final medium and that it's going to sound good on just about any platform that it gets placed on. So the first thing that I have on here is this Studer A800, and this is an old school tape machine that is now a plugin that Universal Audio offers. So tape saturation is actually a great way to add some thickness and some liveliness to your track. And I use this, if not this plugin, then I'll use Slate's virtual tape machine, or at least if I have the ability to use some sort of tape plugin emulation, I would definitely recommend using it on your track. It can definitely help to make your track sound a little bit fuller and also give it a little bit of a little extra liveliness to it. So I'll just play a little bit of the track and I'll add this in and take it out just so you can hear what it sounds like with it and without it.
When you push and I pull, it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion. Push and I pull.
All right, so for me, it pushed out the bass a little bit in the mid range, and it kind of brought the bass to life a little bit. So that's why I like having that one on there. The next one we got is this API plugin, and if you look at it, there's actually nothing going on. I haven't even moved any of the knobs, and what it does is it actually brightens up the track a little bit. This is where it helps to really know your gear and your plugins. As far as old school mastering engineers will use physical hardware, and they know what a piece of hardware sounds like because it has a certain type of circuitry. So when you just send audio through the gear, it makes it sound, it kind of changes the sound a little bit, and you can use that kind of like how a chef uses seasoning in different recipes, right? Mixing and mastering engineers are using these hardware units as kind of like flavoring up the song, right? And so what I did with this one was I just put it on here to brighten up the sound. So I'll play you a little bit of this, and you can hear it with it and without it. All right, so when I hit the bypass and I put this EQ in, you should hear that the vocals will become a little bit more present whenever you start to hear the vocals come in.
When you push and I pull, it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion.
All right, and so that is the Universal Audio API 560 EQ plugin. And up next in the chain, we've got the Universal Audio Neve 33609. And I use this for some light compression to just kind of start to even out the overall performance. And anytime you start to add in gain by turning things up, right? By adding the Studer and adding the API, we're adding some saturation with those. We haven't really started to turn anything up. But really, before I start turning things up, I want to start to even out the performance a little bit, even with this plugin. So I'm using the compressor here just for some light compression to just kind of keep the levels in check before I really start turning things up. And it's also a good way to kind of glue all the sounds together a little bit better. So when I put this in, watch this gain reduction here, and you'll see that it's not getting a whole lot of gain reduction. And by gain reduction, that just means how much it's turning down the loudest peaks that go above the threshold.
It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion. Pushing.
All right, and so if you're watching that gain reduction, you could see that the bass is actually what keeps moving that needle. So the bass is probably the loudest thing in the track right now that keeps tripping that off. So that's actually, it's smoothing out, it's kind of smoothing out that bass a bit. And then up next in the chain, we have the Universal Audio Manley EQ. And this is a great EQ, and I'm using it to kind of boost quite a few frequencies inside of the track. So this is where we're starting to get heavy on adding a lot of gain and turning up the volume quite a bit, but on specific frequencies, okay? Anywhere where you see this green light where it says boost, we're turning up those frequencies. So we're turning up 120 hertz by about 4 decibels. And then in this one, we're turning up 3300 hertz here on this band by about 3 decibels. It's the same on both left and right. So this is your left and this is your right. So it's doing it the same on both. And then on the low side of things, we're actually cutting out 330 hertz by about 3 decibels. And so we're just using this to kind of control certain frequencies inside of the track. And so this is what it sounds like when we add this in.
It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion.
So it just helps the vocals stand out a little bit more inside of the track too, which is kind of nice. It's giving a little bit of presence to the vocals and kind of cleaning out a little bit of the muddiness in this low mid range, about 330 hertz. Up next in the chain, we have another compressor, all right? And this is just gonna start to compress the sound a little bit more since we're adding gain in with this Manley mastering EQ that's just before this. So again, you won't see the needles move very much for very much gain reduction, but we're using this to kind of smooth it out again, and we're just turning it up on the output a little bit, so it's going to help it to get louder.
When you push and I pull, it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion.
So you can see the needles are barely moving on this just yet. But again, when we add these things up, the cumulative effect of adding every single one of these little small choices that we made through this, it's going to make a bigger and better sound at the end of all of this. So after this, Shadow Hill's mastering compressor is this maximizer. And we're really using this to start turning up the gain. Because overall, we kind of, the sound I've gotten out of those plugins combined, it sounds pretty good. So I'll play it with, before we turn up the maximizer, I'll play it with all of these added in now.
When you push and I pull, it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion. Push and I pull, it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion.
So you can start to hear that it's already starting to get louder. And if we put the isotopes insight down here after all of that, we can start to see by how much louder it's starting to get. But again, now we're going to add in this maximizer, and we're going to start to turn up the volume even more with this. So we'll add all these back in, and we'll add the maximizer to that.
It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of the.
All right, and again, I'm using this maximizer as a way to kind of saturate the sound and to just drive it and turn it up more and add some more gain to the track overall. And if we check our insight, so that we'll play this without it, and then we'll start adding all of these, and you'll start to see the average level rise on this integrated LUFS.
It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion. Push and I pull. It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the.
All right, so you can see that by adding in that maximizer, we're really starting to push the loudness up of this track. And then the next one in the chain, there's another EQ, okay? But I'm using what's called mid-side processing with this EQ, and I'm actually using this equalizer to make it sound wider than what it really is. And this is a concept I'll break down in a little bit. So this is what it sounds like when I add this in.
It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion. Push and I pull. It's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high.
All right, and this is really just to start making it sound like it's wider than it really is. And then the last thing in the chain is this limiter, and this is really just to make sure that nothing goes above, again, that 0 dB FS, right? So 0 is the max, so we want to make sure that our output is not going above 0. And again, I always set this to, for me personally, I'll set this to minus 0.1 decibels just to make sure it doesn't actually get to 0. And that's just a little precautionary thing that I picked up from other mastering engineers as a way to make sure that your track doesn't ever hit 0. And so again, this is just keeping the levels in check, and we can also turn this input up if we want to make it louder as well. All right, so if I turn on Insight and we check this out now with the level, and when I add the limiter in there,
it's inevitable. It's the force, the light, the fight, the high, the laws of emotion.
so what you can see here is the gain reduction. It's turning something down. It's turning the loudest peak down by about 2 decibels. So it's definitely making sure that nothing gets above that minus 0.1. The limiter should be the last thing in your chain whenever you're mastering. It's just to make sure that nothing hits 0 or goes above 0 dBFS. Now, you don't always have to use this many plugins on your master. Really, at a minimum, you're probably going to want to use an EQ, a compressor, and a limiter. And maybe an EQ that allows for mid-side processing, which I'll be covering in the next video. And it's something that can really improve not only your mastering, but also your mixes. And it's something that I don't hear getting talked about a whole lot.